Camila Adebayo froze on the steps of the private jet, clutching the lace of her wedding gown like a lifeline. She thought she was flying to Jeju to nurse a sick, paralyzed tech mogul. She was wrong. The man waiting for her on the tarmac wasn't a businessman. He was a warlord. Minjun Kim sat in his wheelchair, shirt ripped open to reveal dark, geometric gang tattoos, fresh blood dripping from his lip, and a loaded pistol resting casually on his knee. He looked up at her with eyes deadlier than a loaded chamber and racked the slide. "Welcome to hell, Mrs. Kim. He's the exiled head of the Shadow Lotus Syndicate. She's the innocent art curator sold to save her brother's life. One fortress full of assassins, a marriage contract written in blood, and a husband who might be the most dangerous man in Korea. But what happens when the innocent curator uncovers the syndicate's weakness and realizes the monster in the wheelchair is the only thing keeping her alive? Buckle up. This isn't a fairy tale, it's a war zone. If you're new here, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more shocking romance thrillers. Your support keeps these stories coming. Now, let's see how this nightmare began. The fluorescent lights of the Lagos University teaching hospital buzzed like trapped flies, a headache pulsing rhythmically behind Camila's eyes. It had been 48 hours since she'd left her younger brother's bedside, 48 hours of watching monitors beep in a rhythm that felt too slow, too fragile. When Dr. Balagan finally emerged from the ward, his face was a map of apology she knew too well. "The valve is failing faster than we anticipated, Ms. Adebayo," he said, his voice low enough to be drowned out by the chaotic din of the corridor. "Without the specialist in Seoul, he won't make it to the end of the month." Camila felt the floor tilt beneath her heels. "I have the deposit. I sold the gallery shares. I just need a little more time to liquidate the studio." "We don't have time," the doctor said gently, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder before walking away to the next tragedy. Camila slumped onto the cracked plastic chair, burying her face in her hands. Her phone vibrated against her thigh, another overdue notice from the bank. She was 26, a respected curator in the city's thriving art scene with a sharp eye for brilliance, yet she was drowning. She had sold her car, her jewelry, and even her mother's vintage lace. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. "Ms. Adebayo?" The voice didn't belong to a nurse. It was crisp, accented, and dangerously calm. Camila looked up to find a man in a charcoal suit standing over her. He looked entirely out of place amidst the peeling paint and humidity, holding a sleek black tablet like a shield. "Who are you?" she asked, wiping a stray tear with the back of her hand, her defensive walls instantly going up. "I am an associate of the Kim family," he said, sitting beside her without asking. He didn't offer a handshake, he offered a file folder. "We understand you are in need of a miracle. We are in need of a wife." Camila stared at him, blinking. "Excuse me." "Minjun Kim. Heir to the Kim legacy. He requires a spouse for optical reasons. A contract marriage. 1 year. Complete discretion." He tapped the tablet, displaying a wire transfer amount that made Camila's breath hitch. It was more money than she could make in 10 lifetimes. "In exchange, we will fly your brother to Seoul tonight. The best cardiac surgeons in the world are already on standby." She looked at the photo attached to the file. Minjun. He was striking, even in the grainy image, but there was a coldness in his eyes that chilled her. "You want to buy me," she whispered, the realization settling like lead in her stomach. "We want to borrow you," the man corrected, checking his expensive watch. "But the jet leaves in 2 hours. With or without you. And with or without your brother." Camila looked through the glass partition at her brother's sleeping form. He looked so small, his chest barely rising. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the pen. The ink was barely dry on the heavy cream bond paper before Mr. Park snatched the contract away, slipping it into his briefcase with the efficiency of a mortician closing a casket. There was no handshake, no congratulations. Just a curt nod to the team of paramedics who immediately swarmed her brother's bed, prepping him for the separate medical transport. Camila watched them wheel him away, her heart hammering against her ribs, until the sliding doors cut off her view. "He is in good hands now, Mrs. Kim," Mr. Park said, the new title landing on her skin like a brand. "Your flight is waiting." The Gulfstream G650 waiting on the tarmac was a sleek silver bullet, a vessel of unimaginable wealth that felt more like a prison transport than a luxury craft. Inside, the cabin smelled of rich leather and chilled air. Camila sank into a seat that cost more than her entire education, refusing the glass of champagne a silent stewardess offered. As the lights of Lagos faded beneath the clouds, replaced by the endless black void of the ocean, the reality of her decision settled in. She leaned her head against the cool window, closing her eyes. She tried to picture the man she had just married. Min-Jun Kim. The reports described him as a recluse, a tragedy. She imagined a pale, fragile invalid, wasting away in a sterile room. Her life, she reasoned, would be quiet. Sad perhaps, but safe. She would be a glorified nursemaid, pushing a wheelchair through manicured gardens, reading art history books to a man too weak to hold them himself. There would be no passion, but there would be peace. Her brother would live, and she would fade into the background of a silent mansion, invisible and unharmed. Hours bled into one another until the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with tension. "We are beginning our descent into Jeju. Weather is uncooperative. Please strap in." The plane shuddered violently as it hit the storm front. Outside, jagged forks of lightning tore through the purple sky, illuminating the churning dark water of the Korea Strait below. The turbulence tossed the heavy jet like a toy, the engines screaming against the wind. Mr. Park appeared from the forward cabin, balancing easily against the swaying floor. He carried a garment bag. "Put this on," he ordered, hanging it on the hook beside her. Camila stared at him. "Now." "The family expects a bride upon arrival," he said, his face impassive. "Not a tourist." She unzipped the bag. Inside was a wedding gown of intricate white lace, heavy and ghost-like. As she changed in the cramped lavatory, the plane dropped suddenly, her stomach lurching into her throat. She gripped the sink, staring at her reflection. The woman staring back looked terrified, dressed for a ceremony that felt more like a sacrifice. The landing gear locked into place with a mechanical groan that sounded like a dungeon door slamming shut. They hit the runway hard, the tires screeching against wet asphalt. As the jet taxied to a halt in the driving rain, Camila smoothed the silk of her skirt, steeling herself to meet a weak, broken man. She had no idea the storm outside was the safest thing she would face tonight. The cabin door hissed open, and the storm rushed in, whipping the heavy lace of Camila's gown around her legs like a shroud. The wind screamed across the tarmac, carrying the scent of ozone and jet fuel, but it was the sight awaiting her at the bottom of the stairs that froze the breath in her lungs. She had prepared herself for a hospital scene, a fragile, sickly man wrapped in blankets, surrounded by fussing nurses. She had prepared for pity. She was not prepared for a war zone. Floodlights cut through the driving rain, illuminating a circle of black SUVs and armed men. In the center of them sat Min-Jun Kim. He wasn't the pale invalid from the file. He was a vision of beautiful, terrifying violence. His black dress shirt was ripped open to the sternum, revealing a chest heaving with exertion and arms covered in dense, geometric ink that seemed to move with the shadows. Blood, bright and fresh, dripped from a cut on his lip, staining his collar. Resting casually on his knee, his fingers curled around the grip, was a matte black pistol. Camila stopped dead on the last step, the rain instantly soaking her veil. Min-Jun looked up, his eyes locking onto hers with a predatory intensity that made her knees buckle. There was no warmth, only a cold, lethal fury. He racked the slide of the gun, the metallic clack-clack echoing sharper than the thunder. "Welcome to hell, Mrs. Kim," he rasped, his voice rough like gravel. He didn't look at her again, turning his gaze to Mr. Park, who was descending behind her. "I said no. Send her back. Now." "The contract is executed, sir," Mr. Park shouted over the wind, unfazed by the weapon or the blood. "The funds have cleared in Lagos. The brother is airborne. She is your wife. She's a liability." Min-Jun roared, the veins in his neck cording. "Look at her. She'll be dead in a week." "Then keep her alive," Park replied coldly, signaling to the guards. Before Camila could scream, two men in tactical gear flanked her, urging her toward the lead SUV. She looked back at Min-Jun, pleading with her eyes, but he had already turned his wheelchair away, holstering the weapon with a movement too practiced to be casual. "Get in," a guard barked, shoving her into the leather back seat. Min-jun hoisted himself into the vehicle beside her with shocking upper body strength. Ignoring the wheelchair, the guards collapsed into the trunk. The door slammed shut, sealing them in silence. The convoy peeled out, speeding away from the airfield and into the black, twisting roads of the island. Camila pressed herself against the door, terrified to look at the man breathing heavily beside her, the smell of rain, expensive cologne, and copper blood filling the small space. They were heading into the darkness, toward a home that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress. The convoy wound its way up the coastal cliffs, passing through 3 separate checkpoints before the iron gates of the Kim estate finally groaned open. If Camila had expected a traditional Korean palace or a modern glass villa, she was mistaken. The structure rising from the mist was brutalist and imposing. A sprawling monolith of grey concrete and black steel that looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to withstand a siege. The SUV stopped in the covered portico. Before Camila could move, the door was jerked open. Min-jun didn't wait for her. Guards swarmed the vehicle, assisting him into a fresh wheelchair with practiced, clinical efficiency. He didn't look back at his new bride. He simply signaled to his men, and they whisked him away down a side corridor, leaving a trail of wet tire tracks and silence in his wake. Camila stepped out, her sodden wedding dress heavy against her skin, dragging across the polished black marble of the foyer. The house was freezing. The air smelled of filtered oxygen and old money, sterile, expensive, and utterly void of life. Everywhere she looked, tiny red lights blinked from the ceiling corners. Cameras. She wasn't a guest here, she was a prisoner under surveillance. Mrs. Kim. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was older than the other guards, with graying hair and a face carved from granite. He wore an earpiece and a suit that struggled to conceal a shoulder holster. "I am Chief of Security Kong," he said, his English perfect but mechanical. "I will show you to your quarters. Your luggage has already been screened and delivered." "Screened?" Camila asked, her voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "Standard protocol," Kong replied, turning on his heel. "Follow me." He led her through a maze of hallways lined with minimalist art, pieces she recognized from auction catalogs, worth millions, yet hung without passion or proper lighting. They passed expansive windows looking out over the storm-battered cliffs, but the glass was thick, bulletproof, distorting the view. "Your movements within the residence are unrestricted," Kong recited as they walked, "with the exception of the basement levels, the server room, and the armory. You are not to leave the perimeter of the estate without my direct authorization and a full security detail." He stopped abruptly at the intersection of 2 hallways. To the left lay a wide, well-lit gallery leading to the guest suites. To the right, a heavy steel door sat at the end of a dim corridor, flanked by a biometric keypad. Camila took a step toward the steel door, drawn by a strange, low hum emanating from behind it. Kang's hand shot out, blocking her path. He didn't touch her, but the air between them grew instantly heavy. "Not that way," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "What's down there?" Camila asked, shivering. "The East Wing," Kong stated, his eyes hard. "It is the Master's private sector. No staff, no guests, and certainly no family are permitted entry." He leaned in slightly, the threat veiled but unmistakable. "If you value your position here, Mrs. Kim, you will forget that door exists. Curiosity is a dangerous trait in this house." The silence of the fortress was heavier than the storm had been. At 3 a.m., the sprawling estate felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum, the air scrubbed clean of any warmth or scent. Camila lay awake in the center of a bed large enough for 3 people, staring at the blinking red eye of the smoke detector, unable to close her eyes. Every shadow looked like a gunman, every creak of the settling concrete sounded like a breach. Then, the scream tore through the darkness. It wasn't a cry of fear. It was a raw, guttural sound of agony, jagged and wet, echoing up from the lower levels like a soul being dragged to hell. Camila sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited, hoping it was a nightmare, but the sound came again, a long, strangled roar that ended in a sob. Against every instinct screaming at her to lock the door, she slid out of bed. She grabbed a silk robe, wrapping it tight around her shivering frame, and stepped into the corridor. The hallway was empty. The night staff had vanished. She followed the sound, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. It led her past the guest wing, past the darkened gallery, toward the one place she had been explicitly forbidden to go, the east wing. The steel door Kong had guarded was now slightly ajar. A harsh, clinical white light spilled out onto the floor, cutting through the shadows. The screaming had stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy, ragged breathing and the clank of metal. Camilla crept to the edge of the doorframe and peered inside. It wasn't a torture chamber, at least not in the way she had feared. It was a high-tech rehabilitation gym, filled with chrome machinery and medical monitors. In the center of the room, between a set of parallel bars, was Min-jun. He was stripped to the waist, his body a map of violence. The geometric tattoos covering his arms and chest were slick with sweat, glistening under the harsh lights. But it was his back that made Camilla cover her mouth to stifle a gasp. A jagged, angry scar ran down his spine, the mark of the bullet or the crash that had taken his legs. A man in scrubs, a physical therapist, was kneeling behind him, manipulating Min-jun's paralyzed legs with forceful, rhythmic motions. Again, the therapist ordered, his voice flat. "Wait," Min-jun gasped, his head hanging low, his knuckles white as he gripped the bars. His entire body was trembling, muscles spasming in revolt. "The nerves are responding, sir. We cannot stop." The therapist bent Min-jun's knee, forcing the joint. Min-jun threw his head back and screamed again, a sound of pure, unadulterated nerve pain that made Camilla's stomach turn. He wasn't the cold, arrogant warlord she had met on the tarmac. He was a man being broken apart and put back together, piece by agonizing piece. His strength, his ruthless confidence, was a mask. Underneath, he was fighting a war against his own body. His arms gave out. He collapsed onto the mat with a heavy thud, lying there, heaving for air, tears of exertion mixing with the sweat on his face. "Get out," Min-jun wheezed to the therapist, his voice broken. "Get out." Camilla stepped back into the shadows, her heart breaking for the monster she was supposed to fear. She realized then that the violence in his eyes wasn't just hatred for the world, it was hatred for his own helplessness. She turned and fled back to her room before she could be seen, the sound of his ragged breathing haunting her all the way back to the safety of the dark. The dining room was a shark tank disguised as a banquet hall. The table was a slab of black obsidian, long enough to land a plane on, set with crystal that caught the candlelight like shrapnel. Camilla stood in the doorway, her hands trembling in the folds of the crimson silk dress Min-jun's staff had forced her into. It was cut low and tight, a weapon, not a garment. At the head of the table sat Min-jun, his wheelchair locked in place. He looked lethal in a tuxedo, but the tension radiating off him was palpable. Opposite him sat 3 men. 2 were Korean lieutenants, but the third, the guest of honor, was a massive man in flowing Agbada robes. Chief Okeke, a warlord controlling the shipping lanes Min-jun needed to move his product out of Lagos. The air was thick with insults. Chief Okeke was standing, his face twisted in a scowl, his heavy gold rings clinking against the table. "I do not do business with boys who cannot stand to shake my hand," Okeke boomed, his voice echoing off the cold walls. "It is an insult to my ancestors. You send a cripple to lead wolves." Min-jun's hand twitched toward the steak knife. His eyes were dark, humiliated fury burning behind them. He opened his mouth to retort. Likely something that would start a bloodbath, but Camilla stepped forward. "In the old kingdom of Oyo," she said, her voice clear and melodic, cutting through the testosterone-heavy silence, "a king never rises for his guests. To stand is to lower oneself to the level of the petitioner. To sit is to rule." Every head turned. Min-jun stared at her, stunned. Camilla walked into the room, her chin high, embodying the royalty she spoke of. She didn't look at Min-jun, she looked directly at Chief Okeke. She dropped into a perfect, respectful curtsy, knees low, head bowed, the traditional greeting of a daughter to an elder in their shared culture. "Kobo Baba," she greeted him in flawless Yoruba. "My husband offers you the stillness of the mountain, not the disrespect of the fool." Chief Okeke froze. The anger in his eyes flickered, replaced by shock, and then, slowly, recognition. He looked from the respectful woman on the floor to the stoic man in the wheelchair. The insult had been reframed into a power move. "You have a daughter of the soil in this ice palace?" Okeke asked, a slow grin spreading across his face. He sat back down, the tension breaking like a fever. "And she has a tongue of silver." Min-jun didn't miss a beat. He recovered his mask of cold authority, though his eyes lingered on Camila with a new, unreadable expression. "My wife speaks for my house," Min-jun said smoothly, pouring a drink. "And she is right. We do not stand for anyone." For the rest of the meal, Camila translated not just the language, but the intent, smoothing over rough edges and turning a disastrous negotiation into a solidified alliance. When the dinner ended and the men shook hands, Min-jun remaining seated, Okeke bowing slightly, Min-jun waited until the doors closed. He turned his wheelchair to face her. The hatred was gone, replaced by a terrifying curiosity. "You lie well, Mrs. Kim." "I didn't lie," Camila whispered, her adrenaline crashing. "I just curated the perspective." The heavy oak doors of the dining hall clicked shut, sealing the scent of cigar smoke and roasted meat behind them. Camila exhaled, the adrenaline from her performance finally draining away, leaving her knees weak. She turned toward the staircase, desperate for the sanctuary of her room, but the sharp whine of an electric motor cut through the silence. "Stop." It wasn't a request. Camila froze as Min-jun emerged from the shadows of the corridor. He didn't look like a man who had just secured a multi-million-dollar shipping route. He looked like a man who had just discovered a bomb in his bedroom. "I'm tired, Min-jun," she said, clutching her clutch like a shield. "If you want to thank me, send it in a memo." "Thank you." He laughed, a dark, humorless sound. He surged forward, the wheelchair moving with terrifying speed. Before she could step back, he cut off her path, driving the chair hard until the metal footrests slammed against the wall on either side of her ankles. Camila gasped, pressed flat against the silk wallpaper. She was trapped in the cage of his making. "You didn't just translate," Min-jun hissed, locking the brakes. He leaned forward, his face inches from her hip, forced to look up but somehow still looking down on her. "You manipulated a warlord. You played him like a fiddle. An art curator from Lagos doesn't know the intricacies of Oyo royal protocol. Who are you really? Who sent you?" "My brother is dying," Camila snapped, her fear sparking into anger. She didn't shrink away. She leaned down, meeting his glare eye to eye. "That is who sent me. Desperation. I studied African history because it is my history. I know how to handle men with ego because I am looking at the king of them right now." Min-jun's eyes narrowed, searching her face for the lie. He gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white, his body radiating a heat that bridged the small gap between them. He was used to fear. He was used to pity. He wasn't used to a woman who could parry his strikes. "You are dangerous," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "I'm helpful," she corrected, her breath hitching as his gaze dropped to her lips. "That's what makes you dangerous." He reached out, his hand hovering near her waist, the tips of his tattooed fingers brushing the silk of her dress. The air in the hallway suddenly felt too thin, charged with a violent electric magnetism. For a second, the anger vanished, replaced by a raw, suffocating hunger. He looked at her not as a contract, but as a challenge he desperately wanted to conquer. "Don't think this makes us partners," he whispered, pulling his hand back as if burned. "It just makes you a target." He unlocked the brakes and spun the chair around, disappearing into the dark before she could see the flush rising on his neck. The door to the master suite was unlatched, a rare oversight in a house built on paranoia. Camila, intending to return the tablet Mr. Park had left in the dining room, knocked once. When no answer came, she pushed the wood with her fingertips, the heavy door swinging inward on silent hinges. She expected an empty room. She found a revelation. Min-jun sat on the edge of his low, sprawling bed, his back to the door. He had shed the tuxedo jacket and the shirt, leaving his upper body starkly exposed to the pale moonlight filtering through the bulletproof glass. Camila's breath caught, not in her throat, but deep in her chest. She was an art curator. She had spent her life studying canvas and sculpture, understanding how pain could be transmuted into beauty. But she had never seen anything like this. His back was a mural of violence and devotion. Thick, black ink swirled from his shoulders down to his hips, geometric lotus flowers entangled with jagged, thorny vines. It was masterful, a bodysuit that marked him as royalty in a kingdom of criminals. But the art was broken. A thick, knotted scar, pink and angry, ran directly down his spine, disrupting the perfect symmetry of the tattoos. It was the mark of the bullet that had severed his connection to his legs, a brutal slash through the masterpiece. Other scars, older and fainter, crisscrossed his ribs. Knife wounds, burns, the history of a life lived at war. Min-jun sensed her presence. The muscles in his shoulders bunched, and he whipped his head around, his eyes wild with a feral, protective instinct. "Get out!" he snarled, reaching blindly for a silk robe to cover himself, his face twisting in a mix of rage and shame. "Do you not know how to knock?" Camila didn't move. She didn't apologize. And crucially, she didn't look away. Most people looked at his wheelchair with pity, or at his face with fear. Camila looked at his skin with reverence. "The artist," she said softly, stepping into the room instead of retreating. "Who did the shading on the lotus? It's specific. Edo period technique." Min-jun froze, the robe half raised. He blinked, the venom dying on his tongue. He expected disgust. He expected her to flinch at the mangled flesh of his back or the jagged road map of his spine. Instead, she was critiquing the ink. "You're looking at a map of my sins," he said, his voice dropping, "and you ask about the shading?" "I'm looking at a survivor," Camila corrected, her gaze drifting from the scar to his eyes. "The gold in the petals. Kintsugi. The Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold lacquer. Making the cracks part of the history, not the end of it." Min-jun lowered the robe slowly, leaving his chest bare. For the first time since the accident, he didn't feel like a cripple in front of a woman. He felt seen. The silence that stretched between them wasn't cold anymore. It was heavy, suffocating, and terrifyingly intimate. "It's not gold," he whispered roughly, turning fully toward her, the wheels of his chair creaking on the hardwood. "It's a warning. Don't romanticize me, Camila. The ink covers the rot." "Ink preserves," she countered, her voice steady though her pulse raced. "It doesn't hide." She placed the tablet on the dresser and turned to leave, her heart thundering against her ribs. She could feel his eyes on her back, not glaring this time but watching, burning. To keep her mind off the suffocating silence of the house, Camila had buried herself in the one place that made sense, the estate's archives. Kong had reluctantly granted her access, likely assuming she would busy herself with dusting frames or rearranging bookshelves. He was wrong. She wasn't decorating. She was auditing. For 3 hours, Camila had been hunched over the mahogany desk in the library, surrounded by open acquisition ledgers. To the untrained eye, the columns of numbers were just a list of mid-century sculptures and avant-garde paintings. But to a curator who knew the pulse of the global market better than she knew her own heartbeat, the list was a screaming siren. "Impossible," she muttered, tracing a line of text with her finger. She tapped the entry for a 1980s ceramic vase listed at $3 million. The artist was obscure, a minor figure in the post-war movement. The provenance was shaky. No auction house in London or New York would value it above $50,000. She turned the page. Another entry. A monochromatic oil painting purchased from a gallery in Macau for the price of a Picasso. The pattern emerged like a hidden image in a stereogram. The dates of these grossly inflated purchases coincided perfectly with the dates of the shipping losses she had heard Min-jun raging about on the phone earlier that morning. This wasn't bad taste. It was a classic laundering cycle. Someone was siphoning millions out of the syndicate's legitimate accounts, disguising the theft as art investment, and moving the cash offshore. Camila grabbed the heaviest ledger and marched toward the east wing. She ignored the guards this time, her professional confidence overriding her fear of the man. She found Min-jun in his study, staring at a wall of security monitors, a half-empty glass of whiskey near his hand. The room was dark, illuminated only by the blue glow of the screens. He looked up, his expression darkening at the intrusion. "I told you," he warned, his voice low and dangerous, "this wing is restricted." "And I told you that you were looking at the wrong enemies," Camila said, slamming the leather-bound book onto his desk. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the quiet room. Minjun glanced at the book, then at her. "What is this?" "It's the reason your accounts are bleeding," she said, flipping the book open to the bookmarked page. "You think you're losing money to pirates in the strait? You're not. You're losing it to a ghost gallery in Macau." Minjun frowned, shifting his wheelchair closer. "Explain." "This vase," she pointed, her voice steady. "You paid 3 million for it. It's worth 40,000. And this sculpture? 2 million. It's a student replica. Whoever manages your acquisitions is buying worthless junk, invoicing you for masterpieces, and pocketing the difference. It's a wash cycle, Minjun. And it's happening inside your own house." Minjun stared at the numbers. He traced the dates, his eyes widening as the logic locked into place. The violence drained from his face, replaced by a cold, sharp calculation. He looked up at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a liability. He saw a weapon. "Who authorized the purchase orders?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Camila turned the page to the authorization signature at the bottom. "Your uncle," she whispered. "Sangchul." The revelation in the ledger didn't result in a shouting match. It resulted in a terrifying, clinical silence. Minjun stared at the signature of his head of acquisitions, Mr. Choi, for a long minute. Then, he picked up the secure line on his desk and spoke 2 words to Kong. "Bring him." 20 minutes later, the library doors opened. Mr. Choi, a man who usually wore arrogance like a second skin, was shoved inside by 2 guards. He looked disheveled, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. When he saw the open ledger on the desk, the blood drained from his face. Minjun didn't scream. He simply spun his wheelchair around, holding the ceramic vase Camila had flagged, the $3 million fake. "My wife tells me this is a reproduction," Minjun said, his voice deceptively soft. "She tells me I paid the price of a kingdom for a student's practice piece." "She is mistaken, sir," Choi stammered, his eyes darting to Camila with venom. "She is an outsider. She doesn't understand the market." Minjun threw the vase. It shattered inches from Choi's polished shoes, exploding into jagged shards. "She curated the National Museum in Lagos while you were still fetching coffee. Do not lie to me, Choi. Who authorized the inflation?" Choi fell to his knees, trembling. "It was your uncle, Sangchul. He said he would kill my family if I didn't sign the invoices. He's draining the liquid assets, sir. He's preparing for a takeover." The confirmation hung in the air like smoke. Minjun closed his eyes briefly, pain and fury warring on his face. He signaled to Kong. "Take him. He talks to no one but me until I decide his fate." As Choi was dragged out, sobbing, the room fell quiet again. Minjun looked at Camila. The distrust that had defined their interactions since the hangar was gone, replaced by a begrudging, intense respect. She hadn't just saved him money, she had handed him the ammunition he needed to survive the coming war. "Come with me," he said abruptly. He led her away from the dark, oppressive East Wing, navigating the corridors to the far side of the house where the architecture softened. He stopped before a set of double doors that hadn't been opened in years and punched in a code. The doors swung open. Camila gasped. It was a conservatory, walled entirely in glass, overlooking the stormy sea. The light here was gray but natural, filtering in from the sky. In the center of the room stood a heavy wooden easel, pristine canvases, and rows of high-quality oil paints that smelled of linseed and potential. "You are an artist," Minjun said, his voice rough, as if kindness was a foreign language he was struggling to speak. "This house is a prison. I know that better than anyone. But in here..." He gestured to the empty canvas. "In here, you are free. Create something real, Camila. God knows we have enough lies in this house." He turned his chair to leave, but stopped at the threshold. "And Mrs. Kim? Thank you." Seoul tasted like freedom, even through the filter of exhaust and rain. For the first time in weeks, Camila was outside the fortress walls, ostensibly to inspect a potential acquisition at a private gallery in Gangnam, though it was really Minjun's way of letting her breathe. But the breathing room was an illusion. 4 guards shadowed her every step, their earpieces buzzing like angry hornets. As she stepped out of the gallery onto the wet pavement, the air shifted. The hair on her arms stood up, a primal warning she had learned to trust since arriving in Korea. A white delivery van screeched to a halt at the curb, cutting off her path to the waiting limo. The side door slid open with a metallic rattle. Before her detail could react, 3 men in masks surged out. "Grab her!" one shouted in rough Korean. Camila turned to run, but a hand clamped onto her wrist, twisting hard. She screamed, swinging her heavy tote bag into the attacker's face, but the second man grabbed her waist, lifting her feet off the ground. They were dragging her toward the dark, gaping maw of the van. "Secure the target." The shout didn't come from the kidnappers. It came from the street. A matte black armored SUV roared around the corner, ignoring the traffic lanes. It didn't brake. It accelerated, slamming into the side of the white van with the force of a wrecking ball. Metal shrieked, glass exploded, and the kidnappers were thrown off balance, dropping Camila to the wet asphalt. The rear door of the SUV flew open before the wheels stopped spinning. Min Jun didn't step out. He leaned out, suspended by the grab handle, his upper body hanging from the vehicle like a gunner on a chopper. In his hand was the matte black pistol she had seen on the tarmac. He didn't hesitate. Bang! Bang! 2 shots. 2 kidnappers dropped, clutching their legs, their kneecaps shattered. The third man raised his weapon toward Camila. Min Jun roared, a sound of pure, terrified fury. He fired a 3rd time, the bullet striking the man's shoulder, spinning him around. "Get her in." Min Jun screamed at his guards, his eyes wild, his composure completely fractured. "Get her in the car." Kong and the detail swarmed the scene, suppressing the threat, but Camila only saw Min Jun. He was pale, his chest heaving, his gun still trained on the groaning men. As the guards shoved her into the back seat beside him, he didn't scold her. He didn't lecture. He grabbed her face with his free hand, his fingers digging into her skin, smearing a drop of blood on her cheek. He scanned her frantically, checking for cuts, for bruises, for life. "Did they touch you?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a rage she had never heard before. "If they touched you, I will burn this entire city down." "I'm okay," she gasped, shaking uncontrollably. "I'm okay." Min Jun pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her neck, his gun still gripped tight in his other hand. "Drive," he ordered the driver, his voice lethal. "And tell Kong to leave no one standing." The safe house was a penthouse apartment in Incheon, a sterile box of glass and steel overlooking the grey harbor. The moment the heavy security door hissed shut, locking the world out, the silence that followed was deafening. Min Jun spun his wheelchair around, his chest heaving. The gun was gone, tucked away, but his hands were still trembling with the aftershocks of violence. He looked at Camila, who was leaning against the wall, clutching her torn coat, her eyes wide and dark with shock. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to the leather sofa. He wheeled himself over to the wet bar, grabbing a bottle of water and a first aid kit. He moved with a frantic energy she had never seen, the cool, calculated warlord replaced by a man on the edge of a breakdown. He returned to her, ripping open an antiseptic wipe. "Give me your hand," he said, his voice rough. Camila extended her wrist. It was already bruising, purple finger marks blossoming on her dark skin where the kidnapper had grabbed her. Min Jun stared at the mark. He didn't clean it immediately. He touched the bruise with his thumb, his jaw working as he ground his teeth together. "I told them to send you back," he whispered, the words sounding like they were being torn from his throat. "Day 1. I told them." Min Jun. "I didn't want a wife," he snapped, looking up at her, his eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. "Do you know why? It wasn't because I prefer solitude. It wasn't because I am broken." He cleaned the wound, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the anger in his voice. "In my world, you don't have things you love. Because the moment you love something, it becomes a target. It becomes a weakness. A lever for my enemies to pry me open." Camila's breath hitched. "Is that what I am? A weakness?" Min Jun stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the woman who had translated for kings and uncovered traitors, the woman who had looked at his scars and called them art. "You are the only thing that scares me," he admitted, the confession hanging heavy in the air. "When I saw them touch you, I didn't think about the syndicate. I didn't think about the money. I just wanted to kill them all. You make me irrational, Camila. You make me human. And that is dangerous." Camila reached out, cupping his face. His skin was hot, feverish with adrenaline. "Then let's be dangerous together." Minjun groaned, a low sound of defeat, and surged forward. He gripped the back of her neck and pulled her down to him. The kiss wasn't tentative. It was an explosion. It tasted of rain, whiskey, and survival. It was desperate and claiming, a release of weeks of suffocating tension. Minjun kissed her like he was drowning and she was air, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her closer until there was no space left between the silk of her dress and the hard line of his chest. For the first time, the contract didn't matter. The money didn't matter. The only thing that existed was the woman in his arms and the terrifying realization that he would burn the world to ash just to keep her safe. The sterile air of the Asen Medical Center's VIP wing felt colder than the storm outside. Camila stood before the glass wall of the isolation unit, her breath fogging the pain. Inside, her younger brother Tund lay hooked to a constellation of machines, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, fragile rhythm. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by the months of sickness in Lagos, but he was here. He was alive. "He is stable," Minjun said quietly, rolling his wheelchair up beside her. He didn't reach for her hand, not here where eyes could be watching, but his presence was a solid, grounding weight. "The surgical team is the best in Asia. They begin in an hour." Camila turned to him, tears pricking her eyes. "You did this. Despite everything. You got him here." "It was the deal," Minjun replied, though his eyes softened. "I keep my word." The moment shattered as the double doors at the end of the corridor swung open. It wasn't the lead surgeon who approached, but the hospital administrator, a man named Dr. O. He was sweating, his face pale as he clutched a clipboard to his chest like a shield. Two large men in ill-fitting suits stood behind him, not hospital security, and definitely not Minjun's men. "Mr. Kim," Dr. O stammered, avoiding Minjun's gaze. We have a complication." Minjun's eyes snapped to the thugs behind the doctor, his demeanor shifting instantly from husband to warlord. "The boy is prepped. What complication?" "The board," Dr. O swallowed hard. "An emergency motion was filed 10 minutes ago. All pro bono surgeries funded by the Kim Foundation have been suspended pending a financial audit. We've been ordered to halt the procedure." "Halted?" Camila stepped forward, her voice rising in panic. "You can't halt it. He has days, maybe hours." "Who filed the motion?" Minjun asked, his voice deadly calm, though his hand drifted toward the concealed holster inside his jacket. "Chairman Sangchul," the doctor whispered. He made it clear, sir. The hospital's funding depends on his approval. If we operate, he pulls the endowment. The hospital goes dark." Minjun looked at the two thugs. They smirked, a silent message from his uncle. This wasn't about money. It was a hostage situation. Sangchul knew he couldn't get to Minjun inside the fortress, so he had targeted the one thing Camila, and now Minjun, couldn't afford to lose. Minjun pulled his phone from his pocket. He didn't call his lawyer. He called Kong. "Secure the perimeter," Minjun ordered, his eyes never leaving the thugs. "We aren't leaving. And bring the team. If they want to stop this surgery, they will have to come through me." He turned to the terrified administrator. "You tell my uncle that if that boy dies, I don't just pull the endowment. I pull the plug on his entire life. Go in there and scrub up, doctor. You're operating." The typhoon made landfall at midnight, battering the cliffs of Jeju like a hammer against an anvil. Inside the fortress, the air was thick with a static tension that had nothing to do with the weather. They had returned from the hospital only hours ago, leaving Tund under heavy guard, but Minjun knew the reprieve was temporary. His uncle had played his hand at the hospital and failed. The next move would be a direct strike. Minjun sat in the main atrium, cleaning his pistol by the light of a single lamp, while Camila paced the floor, the shadows stretching long and thin around her. "You should sleep," he said, the click of the reassembled slide echoing in the cavernous room. "I can't," she replied, wrapping her arms around herself. "Every time the wind hits the glass, I think it's them." As if summoned by her fear, the lights flickered once, twice, and then died. The heavy electronic hum of the estate's security grid whined down into a sickening silence. Total blackness swallowed the room. "Kang!" Minjun barked into the dark, his hand instantly finding the grip of his weapon. "Sir, the generators aren't kicking in," Kang's voice came from the earpiece, distorted by static. "Hard line is cut. We're being jammed." Then came the sound, not the wind, but the distinct crystalline shatter of the bulletproof glass in the east wing being breached by shaped charges. The explosion shook the floorboards beneath Camila's feet. "They're inside," Minjun hissed. "Camila, get to the panic room. Now. I'm not leaving you." "Go," he roared, spinning his wheelchair around. "That's an order." Before she could move, red emergency flares popped in the courtyard, casting the interior in a blood-colored wash of light. Shadows detached themselves from the walls, men in tactical gear moving with lethal precision. "Contact front," Kong shouted from the hallway. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the enclosed space. Minjun fired into the dark, dropping the first shadow that lunged for the atrium doors. "Kong, flank the stairs. We can't get to you." Kong screamed over the comms. They blew the fire doors. "The atrium is sealed off. You're on your own." Minjun cursed, backing his chair toward the cover of a marble pillar. He was cut off. The automated blast shutters had come down, separating him from his security detail, trapping him in the central killing box with the assassins. He saw 3 red laser sights sweep across the room, cutting through the smoke. He fired again, the recoil jarring his shoulder, but he was exposed. A bullet sparked off the metal rim of his wheel, sending him spinning slightly off course. He was a stationary target in a room full of hunters. He looked back for Camila, but the shadows had swallowed her. He was alone. "Come out, nephew," a voice echoed from the darkness, amplified and mocking. "Let's finish what the car accident started." Camila didn't run to the panic room. She ran to the tapestry. While auditing the estate's inventory, she had discovered that the massive 17th-century Flemish weaving in the hallway wasn't just a decoration, it was a shroud. Behind it lay a narrow maintenance corridor, a remnant of the original fortress design intended for servants to move unseen. She knew the house's bones better than the men trying to destroy it. She slipped behind the heavy fabric, the dust of centuries filling her nose, and moved blindly through the crawlspace. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her mind was cold, analytical. She visualized the atrium layout like a gallery floor plan. Minjun is at the north pillar. The shooter is flanking from the east. The sight lines intersect at the fountain. She emerged through a hidden panel in the wainscoting, 10 feet behind the assassin. He was a silhouette against the red flare light, his rifle raised, creeping toward the pillar where Minjun was pinned. Minjun was reloading, his movements frantic. He didn't see the man circling his blind spot. He was seconds away from execution. Camila looked down. The body of one of Kang's men lay twisted on the marble nearby. A pistol lay just out of his reach. She had never held a gun. She had held brushes, chisels, and million-dollar invoices. She reached down, her fingers closing around the cold, textured grip. It was heavier than she expected, a dead weight of steel and consequence. "Don't think," she told herself. "It's just point and shoot." Like a camera shutter. The assassin stepped forward, aligning his shot. "Hey!" Camila screamed, her voice cracking. The assassin spun around, surprised to find a woman in a silk dress standing in the kill zone. But he was too slow. Camila didn't hesitate. She didn't close her eyes. She raised the weapon with both hands, channeling every ounce of fear into focus, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was a violent kick that nearly tore the gun from her hands. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap in the enclosed space. The bullet struck the assassin in the chest. He crumpled backward, his rifle clattering uselessly across the floor. Silence rushed back into the room, ringing in her ears. Min-jun whipped around from behind the pillar, his own weapon raised, ready to kill the new threat. He froze. He stared at the body on the floor, then up at Camila. She was standing amidst the smoke and the red emergency light, her chest heaving, the smoking pistol still gripped in her trembling hands. She looked terrified, but she also looked magnificent, a warrior forged in the fire of his own war. Camila, he breathed, lowering his gun, his voice full of disbelief and a terrifying kind of awe. She dropped the gun, the metal clanging against the marble, and sank to her knees. I couldn't leave, she sobbed, the adrenaline crashing. I knew the layout. I knew where he would go. Min-jun didn't wait. He wheeled himself over the debris, ignoring the danger, and pulled her onto his lap, wrapping his arms around her so tightly it hurt. He buried his face in her hair, shaking. She hadn't just saved his life, she had crossed a line for him that could never be uncrossed. She was no longer just his wife. She was his accomplice. The sun rose over the Jeju cliffs like a bloody bruise, illuminating the wreckage of the fortress. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence broken only by the crunch of boots on shattered glass. In the center of the ruined atrium, where hours ago bullets had flown, a different kind of court was in session. Sangchul, the man who had ordered the hit on his own nephew, was on his knees. He was stripped of his fine suit, his hands zip-tied behind his back, staring up at Min-jun with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. Min-jun sat in his wheelchair, flanked by Kong and a dozen loyal enforcers. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a king passing judgment. He held the black ledger Camila had found, the evidence of the embezzlement that had started the war. You thought I was weak because I couldn't walk, Min-jun said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. You thought a cripple couldn't lead the lotus. You are weak, Sangchul spat, blood staining his teeth. You let a woman fight your battles. You are a disgrace to the bloodline. Min-jun didn't flinch. He glanced at Camila, who stood by the broken fountain, her silk dress ruined, her face smudged with soot, but her head held high. She wasn't hiding anymore. She didn't fight my battle, Min-jun corrected Koldal. She won my war. He tossed the ledger onto his uncle's lap. I could put a bullet in your head right now. It's what you would do. It's what the lotus demands. Min-jun leaned forward, his eyes dark and unforgiving. But I am done with the lotus. A ripple of shock went through the assembled guards. Min-jun turned his chair to face his lieutenants. We are finished with the shadows. The smuggling, the laundering, the violence, it ends today. We are pivoting entirely to legitimate logistics and the arts sector. Sir. Kong stepped forward, confused. That is a suicide of our power. No, Min-jun said, reaching out to take Camila's hand. He pulled her to his side, interlacing his fingers with hers, gunsmoke and all. It is the only way we survive. I have spent my life building a cage of money and fear. I am tearing it down. He looked back at his uncle. I'm not killing you, Sangchul. That would be too quick. I'm giving you to the prosecutors. With this ledger, you will rot in a cell for the rest of your miserable life, watching me build an empire you can never touch. As the guards dragged the screaming old man away, signaling the end of an era, Min-jun didn't watch him go. He looked up at Camila, exhaustion and adoration warring in his eyes. I promised you hell, he whispered, kissing her knuckles. Let me give you the world instead. The humidity of Lagos was a stark, vibrant embrace compared to the sterile chill of Jeju, but Min-jun didn't mind. He stood at the end of the aisle in the lush garden of the civic center, the lagoon shimmering behind him. He was sweating, not from fear, but from the exertion of holding himself upright. He was standing. His legs shook slightly, supported by an ebony cane inlaid with veins of gold, a deliberate nod to the kintsugi philosophy Camila had taught him. He wasn't cured, the pain was a dull roar in his lower back, but he refused the wheelchair today. Today, he met his wife eye to eye. Beside him, Tund adjusted his own tuxedo. The boy who had been on death's door a year ago was now vibrant and laughing, serving as Min-jun's best man. Steady, brother-in-law, Tund whispered, grinning. Don't fall before she gets here. I would stand through a hurricane for her, Minjun replied, his voice devoid of the old darkness. Then, the talking drums began, a rhythmic, thundering heartbeat that silenced the crowd. The guests were a kaleidoscope of cultures. Minjun's stoic Korean executives in dark suits stood shoulder to shoulder with Camilla's family in vibrant, flowing oso-ebi fabrics of teal and coral. It was a visual treaty, a merging of two worlds that should never have collided. Camilla appeared. She wasn't wearing white lace this time. She was a vision in gold, a modern fusion of a Western silhouette and traditional Yoruba grandeur, her geli head tie rising like a crown. She walked toward him not with the hesitation of a victim, but with the stride of a matriarch. When she reached the altar, she stopped, her eyes filling with tears as she took in his vertical frame. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his chest, right over his heart. "You're standing," she whispered, the sound lost under the drums. "For you," Minjun answered, shifting his weight to free a hand so he could wipe a tear from her cheek. "Always for you." The ceremony was a chaotic, beautiful blend. They exchanged rings and drank from the gourds of palm wine. They bowed to the elders and bowed to each other. When the officiant asked for the vows, Minjun didn't read from a card. "I signed a contract for a shield," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the garden. "I thought I was buying safety. Instead, I found the one person who could teach me that power isn't about control. It's about trust." He gripped her hand tight. "I am no longer the warlord of the Shadow Lotus. I am just your husband. And that is the only title that has ever mattered." Camilla smiled, a radiant, blinding thing. "And I am no longer just a curator of other people's treasures. I have found my own." As they kissed, the crowd erupted, cheers in English, Yoruba, and Korean mixing into a single sound of joy. Minjun leaned heavily on his cane, but as Camilla wrapped her arm around his waist, taking half his weight, he knew he would never truly fall again. They were partners, forged in fire, standing tall in the light.